Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling a pretty big topic.
Yeah.
One that's been debated for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the clash of civilizations.
It's a big one.
It is a big one, and you know what? We have a ton of interesting sources for this one.
Yeah, we do.
Including excerpts from Huntington's original article.
Of course, the landmark article.
Exactly. And some commentary and critiques from other scholars.
A lot of people have thoughts about this.
They do. And our listener is particularly interested in understanding if the world is really destined for conflict along these cultural lines.
A very timely question, I think.
It is. And I got to say, in preparing for this one, some of these arguments were pretty surprising.
Oh, yeah. Huntington's article was meant to provoke a reaction.
It definitely did.
For sure. He was really trying to shake things up in the way people thought about the world after the Cold War ended.
Okay, so for our listener who maybe isn't super familiar with this theory.
Right.
Can you give us like the Huntington in a nutshell version?
Sure. So basically, Huntington argued that in this new world order, right, conflict wouldn't be driven by those old ideological battles like we saw during the Cold War.
Okay.
Communism versus capitalism, that kind of thing.
Right.
Instead, he said the big dividing lines would be cultural and religious.
Okay.
And we'd see different civilizations clashing as they competed for, power and influence.
And he really used that word civilizations, right?
It did. It's a very loaded term, isn't it?
It is, yeah, like something out of a history textbook.
Exactly. He divided the world into these big cultural blocks.
Okay.
Western, Islamic, Confucian, Hindu, and so on. And he argued that these blocks would inevitably clash.
Like almost like tectonic plates colliding or something.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, he really saw it that way.
So he's saying we're all destined for like a global culture war.
Essentially, yeah. He saw this clash as the next logical step in the evolution of conflict. You had conflict between princes, then nations, then ideologies,
right,
and now civilizations. It's a pretty bold claim.
Right. It is bold. And I have to say, some of the things I was reading from his article were a little unsettling.
Yeah, like
that whole Islam has bloody borders statement.
Right.
It just seems so simplistic and honestly a little prejudiced.
Yeah. You're right to be cautious about that kind of language. I mean, that's one of the biggest criticisms of Huntington's work,
Okay.
While he was a respected scholar, that particular argument is seen by many as dangerously reductionist.
Mm-hmm.
It ignores the incredible diversity within the Muslim world and overlooks the fact that conflicts often occur within civilizations, not just between them.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And one of the other sources that you sent me actually talks about this.
Oh, which one?
The article by Syed Mansoub Mersht.
Ah, yes. Mersht makes a great point.
Yeah.
He uses examples of conflicts within Islam itself to show that Huntington's clash model is just too simplistic.
Right.
He argues that you can't just look at culture or religion in isolation. You have to consider the political and economic realities, too.
It's like culture isn't just this, separate thing floating out there.
Exactly.
It's all kind of intertwined.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
And that's a point that several of the sources we're looking at today bring up.
Okay.
They argue that Huntington might have underestimated the impact of things like globalization and how interconnected the world has become.
That's really interesting. I'm definitely curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But first, there's something else about Huntington's theory that I found a little puzzling.
Okay, what's that?
He talks about these core states, right?
He does, yes.
Can you remind us what he meant by that and why it's important to his argument?
Sure. So Huntington believed that each civilization has like a dominant country that acts as a kind of leader or representative.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have the U.S. as the core state of Western civilization, maybe China for the Confucian world and so on.
Yeah.
And he argued that these core states would be the key players in shaping the conflicts between civilizations.
But isn't that a bit of a stretch?
It is a bit presumptuous, isn't it?
Yeah. Like, can you really say that one country speaks for an entire civilization?
That's exactly the point that Takashi Inaguchi makes in his critique of Huntington.
Okay.
He looks specifically at Asia and shows how this whole core state idea breaks down when you look at the complexity of that region.
So how does Inaguchi's argument challenge Huntington?
Well, for example, he points out that there's no clear core state for Islam in Asia. Even though Islam has a huge presence there, you have large Muslim populations in Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India.
Right.
But none of these countries can really be said to represent the Islamic civilization as a whole.
So Inaguchi is basically saying that Asia is just too diverse to fit into these neat little boxes that Huntington created.
Exactly. And he argues that this diversity actually makes a clash less likely. He suggests that instead of clashing, Asian civilizations are more likely to engage in, mutual learning and accommodation.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how some of these critiques are really pushing back against Huntington's vision.
They are for sure.
But if these civilizations aren't necessarily headed for some big showdown,
Right.
how do we explain all the conflict that we see in the world today?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. I mean, surely culture and religion play some role, right?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's exactly what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, good, because I have a lot more questions.
I bet you do. It's tempting to look at a conflict and just say, oh, this is a clash of civilizations.
Right.
But
as we've seen with Huntington, things are rarely that simple.
exactly.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're peeling back the layers of this clash of civilizations idea and finding that maybe it's not as solid as it seemed at first glance.
It's a great way to put it, and actually one of the sources you gave me really digs into this, especially when it comes to how we view and talk about different cultures.
Oh, you mean the piece by Dieter Senghaus?
That's the one. Yeah, the one about essentialism.
Okay. Yeah, that one, I got to admit, that concept kind of tripped me up at first.
It is a bit of a heady term, but it's really important for understanding why Huntington's theory has been so controversial.
Okay, so break it down for me.
Okay, so essentialism is basically the idea that cultures have these fixed, unchanging essences.
Okay.
Like there's some set of core traits that defines everyone in a particular group.
So it's like saying all members of a certain civilization are basically the same deep down.
Right. Even if they have some superficial differences on the surface.
That makes me think about how the media often portrays entire cultures as like a monolithic block.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Like all people from this country believe this, or everyone in that religion behaves like that.
Exactly. It's so reductive.
It is, yeah. It's like assuming everyone in a family is exactly alike just because they have the same last name.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this ties in really well with some of those other critiques we were discussing.
Oh, okay. How's that?
Remember how Inaguchi challenged Huntington's core state idea by looking at the diversity of Asia?
Right. He was saying you can't just assume one country speaks for an entire region or civilization.
Exactly. So if we bring Senghaus into this,
Okay.
we can see how this idea of essentialism is kind of baked into Huntington's thinking by assuming that each civilization has a fixed essence.
Yeah.
It becomes easier to imagine them as these monolithic blocks,
Right.
locked in a struggle for dominance.
Okay, so if we reject this idea of essentialism,
Yeah.
how does that change the way we think about conflict then?
Right. It's a good question, because if it's not just about these big clashing civilizations, then what else is going on?
Exactly.
Well, this is where we have to start considering those other factors that Mersch was talking about.
Okay, the economic inequalities, the political tensions.
All of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
The historical grievances that often fuel conflict.
Right, because he was saying you can't separate culture and civilization from those realities.
Exactly. Conflict is multidimensional. It's not just about culture or religion.
Right, it's about this whole web of interconnected factors.
Exactly. And I think that's so important to emphasize because it helps us move beyond those simplistic us versus them narratives.
Which can be very dangerous.
They can be very dangerous.
But even if we acknowledge all those other factors, doesn't culture still play some role in conflict?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anyone would argue that it doesn't.
Yeah.
We can't just pretend that differences in values and beliefs and traditions don't matter at all.
Right. So then what's the alternative?
Right.
Is there a way that these differences can actually be a source of strength or even peace?
Well, that's where I think it's helpful to bring in someone like Arshan Adib Moghadam,
Okay.
who argues that globalization, despite all its complexities, actually has the potential to foster understanding and cooperation between cultures.
Wait, so he's saying that globalization might actually be working against a clash of civilizations.
Exactly. He points to the increasing interconnectedness of the world,
Okay.
the rise of things like social media and the internet,
Right.
and argues that all of this is creating new opportunities for cultural exchange and dialogue.
So instead of leading to a clash, globalization could lead to more like a fusion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a blending of ideas and traditions.
Interesting.
Adib Moghadam actually gives a really concrete example of this.
Oh, okay. What's that?
He talks about the global popularity of K-pop music.
Oh, yeah. K-pop is everywhere.
It's everywhere, right? And it started in South Korea, but now it has this massive following all over the world.
And it's not just the music.
Yeah.
It's the fashion, the dance moves.
It's a whole cultural aesthetic.
Yeah, it's huge.
Exactly. And Adib Moghadam argues that this kind of exchange can help to break down stereotypes and create a sense of shared humanity.
Oh.
He sees it as a sign that maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
we're moving toward a world where cultural differences are seen as something to be celebrated.
Instead of feared.
Right. Instead of being a source of division.
Okay. I like that vision a lot better than the clash of civilizations.
It's definitely more optimistic.
It is. But I gotta be honest, I'm still a little torn.
Yeah, I get that.
I mean, I see the potential for this exchange and understanding,
Mm-hmm.
but I also see a lot of conflict and division in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do we reconcile those two things?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the world is a complex and messy place.
It is.
There are no easy answers,
Right.
and we're always going to be grappling with these tensions.
Mm-hmm. Between cooperation and conflict,
Yeah,
unity and division.
exactly. It's like we're constantly navigating this gray area,
Yeah.
trying to find that balance between acknowledging our differences,
Mm-hmm.
but also recognizing our shared humanity.
Right. And maybe that's a good place to leave things for now.
Yeah, I think so.
In the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll kind of delve into some of the key takeaways from all these sources
Sounds
and what they mean for you, our listener. All right, so we've really spent some time with this clash of civilizations idea.
We have.
You know, we've explored Huntington's original argument and looked at some pretty strong critiques of it,
Mm-hmm.
and even considered, different ways of thinking about how cultures interact in our globalized world.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
And I think it's a good time to step back and say,
Yeah.
what does this all mean?
Yeah, what can our listeners take away from this deep dive?
Right. What can you take away from all this?
Because it's been kind of a roller coaster ride, to be honest.
It has, hasn't it?
We started with this pretty stark warning about these inevitable cultural clashes
Yeah.
and ended up, talking about K-pop and the potential for globalization to bring people together.
It's true. And I think that really speaks to how complex this whole issue is.
It does.
And honestly, I think one of the biggest takeaways from all of this is that we need to be really wary of these grand narratives.
You mean like these big, sweeping explanations that claim to explain everything?
Exactly. Like the clash of civilizations. They can be really appealing because they offer this sense of order in a world that often feels very chaotic.
Right. Makes you feel like you can predict things.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But as we've seen with Huntington's theory, they can also be really misleading
Mm-hmm.
and even dangerous.
It's like we said before, trying to squeeze the whole world into this tiny little box.
Right.
And things are bound to get distorted in the process.
Yeah, you lose the nuances, you lose the complexity.
Exactly.
And that's why it's so important to, develop that critical thinking muscle,
Mm-hmm.
that ability to question assumptions.
Right, to really dig deeper.
To look beyond the surface.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is the next time you see a headline
Mm-hmm.
screaming about, a clash of civilization.
No, yeah, those headlines are everywhere.
They are. Yeah.
Take a minute to think about what Senghas had to say
Right. About essentialism.
about essentialism. Are we falling into that trap of stereotyping entire groups of people?
Right. Are we missing the nuances?
Exactly. Because even if those headlines aren't intentionally trying to be harmful,
Mm-hmm.
they can reinforce these stereotypes that make it so much harder to see the common ground that we share.
Right. And I think that brings us to another really important point.
What's that?
Cultures aren't these static, unchanging things.
They're not. They're dynamic.
Yeah, they're constantly evolving, interacting, influencing each other.
Absolutely. Think about how much cultures have changed even in our own lifetimes.
Yeah.
The way we communicate the music, we listen to the food we eat.
Mm.
It's all a product of this constant exchange.
And that's a beautiful thing.
It is. It's something to be celebrated, not feared.
Exactly. Like Adib Moghadam was saying,
Mhm.
globalization, despite all its problems,
Right.
it has this potential to create bridges between cultures.
To connect us instead of dividing us.
Exactly. And that's a really hopeful thought, I think.
It is.
But, it also kind of puts a responsibility on us
as individuals.
as individuals. We can't just passively consume culture.
Right.
We have to actively engage with it.
Seek out different perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Challenge our own biases, to be open to learning from people who are different from us.
Yes. Because I think that's really what this whole clash of civilizations debate comes down to.
Okay.
Do we choose to see the world as this battleground of, irreconcilable differences?
Right.
Or do we see it as this tapestry
Oh, I like that.
woven from all these different threads of, countless cultures, each with its own beauty and value?
Each one unique.
Yeah. And that's a question for each of us to answer, I think.
It is a question for each of us.
So on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I think so too.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
We've given our listener a lot to think about.
We have.
So thanks for joining us. And remember, this is just the beginning of the exploration.
Keep learning.
Keep questioning.
You keep the conversation going.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.